So we're going to be joined by Stuart Candy, who is also a futurist. Stuart is the director of the Situation Lab, and he's an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University in the School of Design. And he will be telling you about his work when we get to him. We also have Mashinka Hakopian, and Mashinka just joined us here at ArtCenter this last semester. We're very excited to have her. She is our associate professor the associate professor of technology and social justice here at ArtCenter. And we also have Christine Meinders, who is a graduate of media design practices, who I worked with in her MFA. And she works on Feminist.AI, and which is a collective, and also Poieto. Yeah. And so welcome, everybody. Happy to have you here. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, so I want to begin by acknowledging that the group of people up here today do not represent the full range of perspectives in dealing with technology, social futures, design, and all of that. We're definitely a very privileged crew who have the opportunity to think about these things in a quite exceptional context. And so I just wanted to make it clear that that's the position from which we're speaking about this work. And so let's go down the aisle here. And did you bring your artifacts?
I did, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. So the artifact, I think Christine introduced the idea of bringing artifacts as a way to introduce, for the panelists to introduce themselves, and taking advantage of the material experiential aspect of being here in person, but also of the fact that these technologies live in our lives in real lived ways, is a part of that as well. And so each of one of the things that I asked the panelists to do was to definitely share their work in terms of with kind of vivid examples of what they make. Since we're all creative practitioners, that's where the work lives, but also understanding that the sort of the theoretical and the critical components are just imbued in all of these practices and will come to the surface in the conversation as we go along. So I'm going to hand that off to Stuart.
Thanks, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So to kick off the show and tell, I guess, portion of the panel, I'm, as Anne said, a professional futurist and also a design professor, and I use the processes that we run in the classroom to really equip people with, ideally, tools with which to interrogate whatever futures are relevant to them in their own context. But as a practitioner, I'm doing that with lots of different kinds of organizations. This is from a project with the United Nations Development Program last year. And at the start of last year, as COVID was raging, before I think most or any of us really had a chance to be vaccinated, the UN Development Program was trying to have its annual innovation event, which would usually have taken place in Istanbul, Turkey, but on this occasion had to take place on Zoom. So they contacted me a couple of months out from this event back in January 2021 and said, for this opening event, we want to have a panel about the futures of the global development landscape. Which is a massive topic, and we could spend the rest of the day just unpacking what that means. But it was a panel with the head of the UNDP, the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, the only person in the world who has that title. And this is actually what they asked, basically, how could we bring vividness, dimensionality, vitality to a conversation about an enormous topic that's also really abstract? Because what the hell is a future for development globally when you look 20 or 30 years out? That's quite a challenging question. So what I proposed to do was to interview each of the panelists as soon as possible, like after this call ended, about the futures that they imagined for the development landscape, and then to make something inspired by, or in a way even from, the future that they had described to me. So kind of a prop from the movies in their minds is how we thought about it. So this was an artifact made for Sophie Howe, the Commissioner for Future Generations, based on what she talked about in terms of the need for governments in the future to be more holistic, more sensitive to and inclusive of the concerns of not just very diverse human constituents, but perhaps others. So this is a mailer from the year 2056. This stuff all had to be done on a very short timeline. So this is done in cheap materials that, I could do down at the local FedEx. And so you open this thing, or on the front, I guess it's maybe a little hard to see. And I don't know how many people here speak Welsh, but Sophie Howe lives in Cardiff, right? So this artifact is from the Interspecies Round Table, and everything on it is bilingual English and Welsh. And you open it up, and basically it's telling residents of this area of Cardiff that there has been a zone nearby that's been rewilded over the past several decades. Basically, what today in 2021 or 22 consists of, golf courses and grasslands has been turned into forests and wild areas where salmon are now repopulating the River Taff and wolves are running free. And so this is a message basically from the Interspecies Round Table, which is a reference to the Knights of the Round Table, which, the symbolic significance of which is that the knights were all equal, right, at the round table. And those stories, those myths of King Arthur and co. actually come from that part of the British Isles. So this is a kind of a manifestation of a future fragment from 40 or so years out that is drawing on myth and story that goes many centuries back. And it's basically saying in English and in Welsh that the animals have that the well-being of the ecology has been established to the extent that the animals are essentially consenting to people coming back into these spaces. And there was also attached to this, it's a secondary artifact, a button, a kind of souvenir pin that says "Every voice counts. Parliament of all beings, Wales." So what you're seeing here is a kind of, to echo something Brian said, a second or third order implication through the lens of governance and of political change and of legal change, but a second or third order implication of ecological research that makes it possible to instrument and monitor how certain ecological setups are faring, and the idea of a threshold automatically being triggered that says, okay, it's all right to let people back into these spaces that they used to predominate and lay waste to. This is a fragment from a radically changed political landscape where animal voices are taken seriously. So there you have it.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, Mashinka. This is, I think, a bigger challenge for Mashinka. The artifact.
The artifact. Am I on? Yeah? Okay. Before I go into my artifact, I want to say I love this project so much. And when I was at the Berggruen Institute, I did a roundtable with youth participants with the commissioner's office on the prospect of a civilian climate corps. And I think if we had had an artifact like that for them to, generate imaginaries around, it would have been so incredibly generative.
So for next time, right? That's the idea of these kind of conversation pieces that enable a higher resolution imaginative response.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So my own artifact comes from a project I did last year when I was a visiting professor of the practice at Occidental College. I co-curated a show there called Encoding Futures, Critical Imaginaries of AI. And Christine's group was actually a participant. We were very lucky to have them. So Encoding Futures proceeded from the premise that every algorithm encodes a future, and that those future encodings are not necessarily visible to us because the operations of algorithms and AI systems are so opaque, so intricate, so unknowable, and so labyrinthine, and often by design. This is why we call it the black box, right? Because the rationale that it uses in its automated decision-making is so often hidden from public view. So this exhibition really focused on artists who were bringing to light, making transparent the operations of the black box. And since we were talking about social robots earlier, I'll just point to one really exciting project that we had a chance to display in the show, which was Stephanie Dinkins' work, Conversations with Bina 48. So to give you a very succinct, this is an incredibly rich project, but to give a very succinct account of it, Stephanie Dinkins is an artist who learned about the existence of a robot called Bina 48, a social robot that was produced by Hanson Robotics and the Terrasim Foundation, which is this transhumanist foundation. The robot was modeled on a real person, Bina Rothblatt, who was a Black woman, and Stephanie Dinkins is a Black artist. And she was excited to learn about this because she had never encountered a Black robot before. And she decided to pursue a creative project where she would explore the possibility of building kinship and real relational bonds with this robot. So she underwent this series of visits with the robot and had planned to ask it specific questions that she typically uses to build kinship with other humans, like, who are your people? And when she asked it questions like this, who are your people? What is your experience of racism? Despite the fact that this social robot was coded to be extraordinarily intelligent and in fact ended up being the first robot to successfully complete a college course in philosophy. So it could talk about Descartes and Heidegger. It could not and did not know how to discuss race or racialization. These were blank spots in its code, and it would start to glitch when asked these questions. So the project that Stephanie Dinkins did and that we displayed was a video series of conversations with this robot, negotiating the slippages and the gaps and the data voids in the robot's coding. And this was just one of the ways in which the artists that we were highlighting were creating a space where it becomes possible to apprehend things about AI that otherwise feel hidden from view or unknowable.
Great. Thank you. All right, Christine.
Is this on? Yeah. Great. All right. Well, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be on a panel here with Anne, who was running MDP when I was there, and Mashinka, of course, who has such rich, beautiful work. Encoding Futures was an absolutely amazing experience. And Stuart, and I think one of the first exploratory feminist AI project examples before it kind of morphed into something a little bit different. We prototype with the Think from the Future, which was a little bit prevalent at the time in the lab. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you again, specifically for that statement, looking at what it means to be here on a panel at ArtCenter with all of these different perspectives and representations, maybe that are not present, and being mindful of talking about, okay, can we share some information? Can we start to highlight some of the folks that are doing incredible work here at ArtCenter? And I think for my artifact, I have a made object, but something that I think might be a little bit more interesting is a very, very messy book that highlights and promotes the work of individuals who have made poieto and oftentimes feminist AI happen through their design practice. And this is very specifically visual designers, and maybe just acknowledging some of the beautiful individuals here who are doing a lot of work in anti-racist classroom, who are doing a lot of work at MDP or have graduated from MDP. So I'd love to maybe just kind of share some of those things. All right. I won't go through the whole. So it's only 3. So it looks like a big book. No, I'm almost done. I'll just moving a little bit slowly today. All right. So one of the things that I'd really like to highlight is one of the first poieto projects that deconstructed the approach to AI from very specific perspectives. We were looking at data, materials, form, and rules. But really kind of looking at some of the visual forms and pieces that Nietzsche and Stephanie Cedeno helped design. And so I definitely want to highlight the work, that they did in that space. Then specifically 2017 and 2018, we have Chow or Chloe Wang, who worked on this and designed this visual design. So again, it's a critical AI design tool that was created here at ArtCenter. And these are the individuals who've worked on it from ArtCenter.
And is this all the work of Feminist AI, or is this poieto?
This is poieto.
Poieto.
And so within poieto, absolutely. So poieto is a social tech design tool, and it's used to create social tech AI projects. So you consider the social implications of the design as you build it in. So for example, let's say I'm designing a project on I don't know, let's say I'll give you a very specific example, working with a community maybe that I'm not a part of. for me and my practice and my group that I might be a part of, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to go and design in spaces or speak for voices that we don't have a lived experience with. So what we do is we set up systems where people can define their own governing systems, their own rules, choose how they want their work to be shared and designed, and consider the social implications from their very specific perspectives. And so here, this is by Matt and Michelle. Matt and Michelle are at Google right now. Matt Asato Adams and Michelle Gong. And so you can see some of their cards. And we're almost done. And so here you can see the frames and the lenses through which we view these technologies. So time, bias, reuse, senses, culture being, more than just lived experiences, but gaming culture as an example. And then lastly, I'll just jump to the end. But very specifically, the more recent interface, which is also Matt and Michelle. So I really just wanted to take the time to highlight some of the work coming out of ArtCenter and some of the beautiful work that the visual designers here have crafted and helped in creating this prototype.
And so that's the prototype for Poieto.
Yeah, so it's actually, this is what we teach. So we teach this in elementary schools here in Los Angeles and also in bachelor's and master's programs at California College of the Arts and CalArts.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you.
Sure.
There's one of the through lines that I heard in each of these talks was this idea of revealing invisible governing structures. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the role of creatives in doing that as a design practice, let's say.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are things that I suppose in my own practice and training, I probably attend to naturally because of the way I was raised disciplinarily. So my first degrees were in the history and philosophy of science and in law. And then my master's and PhD were in political science. And so a lot of the kind of artifact work and the experiential scenarios, the effort to bring ideas about the futures to life that can be inhabited and interacted with, they're interested in how systems might change, not just how the kind of the surfaces or the interactions or the material layer atop those deeper systems are encountered. I think that one of the challenges and also opportunities of design kind of pedagogy and education is that designers sort of have a license to roam almost wherever they want, but that doesn't necessarily come with a great deal of attentiveness to or literacy in the systems that they're operating within. So I think one of the things that we kind of need to try to cultivate in having people design for, big picture change or to address wicked problems and, some of that kind of language that has a great deal of currency in many different design education settings, to bring a certain it's like finding the right combination of ambition and humility, and I think that the humility part ties to something very important that you addressed with your opening remark, Anne, about what is and isn't represented in any particular conversation, but also in what Christine was saying about the kinds of about the ways that people encounter and work with communities that are not their own. And I think to me, one of the things that we try to do, that's also, you mentioned, Christine, the thing from the future, this card game that we devised initially for work that my colleague Jeff Watson at USC and I were convening or facilitating when we were kind of in the room, but then becoming curious about how to provide prompts and frameworks that people could, and here I'm echoing what, or thinking of what you were saying about enabling people in their own contexts and in the specific contours of their their needs and communities and identities and histories, for that to be supported by really flexible kind of open source structures for learning together.
Yeah, I think it's so often the case that with emerging technologies, what we see is not only the invisibility of their operations and their structures, but also the concurrent inaccessibility of them, and particularly to communities which are already under-resourced. So some of the ways in which, I often bring up in talks and conversations the concept of the artificial intelligentsia, which is Dr. Sophia Noble's notion of the kind of narrow coteries of self-styled specialist aficionados who do have access to these things, and from whom there's often a kind of like gatekeeping that occurs. In working with my own community, so I'm Armenian, I live in Glendale, and a lot of my work is in the context of Swana communities and with Swana communities. What I have found is that there is a kind of forbidding barrier to entry a lot of the time. And so in the 2020 Artsakh war, which was a moment where Azerbaijan staged a military offensive targeting the Armenian populated region of Artsakh, I collaborated with a group of artists, Nancy Baker Cahill, Kami Abrahamian, and Nelly Sarkisian, to produce this AR monument that was installed on Artsakh Avenue in Glendale that read Artsakh Endures. And there was this question for us initially of, imagining and projecting a future superimposed virtually over the present. But there was this question for us of whether we were generating something that it would be difficult for the community to access or interact with. You have to download a free app called Fourth Wall app. You have to have a smartphone, and you have to be able to, be mobile enough to make it to this corner. And so we were very conscious of that sort of thing. And also of whether this kind of technology would speak to community members. And then I was really moved and kind of astonished to hear later on that there were groups of Armenian elders who were sort of going together collectively to this site to visit this work and helping one another access it, using their pooling their shared knowledge of how to download an app and how to see an augmented reality monument. So I bring this anecdote up to say both that I think it's really important to acknowledge these barriers to entry, and then also at the same time to hold space for the fact that what we perceive to be a difficulty or a barrier is often a projected perception, because if elder members of my community can do this, I think that really showed to me the falseness and the fallacy of some of my own assumptions about what interaction would look like.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with young people? Sure. With kids? Yeah, I want to hear a bit more about that.
And I think it really kind of ties into this visibility of governing system, because a lot of what we're trying to do is rethink and reimagine existing approaches to education and honor the ways that individuals are learning. And often, as we see in 3rd through 12th, and I would argue bachelor's and master's, a lot of times it's very, it's driven on grading. It's driven on testing, all of these assessments. And just going into some of the schools, all you see is students at computers just doing assessments. And one of the things that's really helpful about this is coming at this from an arts, a critical creative tech practice, because we are teaching creative tech, but we're teaching it with the resources and the knowledge from the communities that we're working in. So number one, we have to be invited to a school through someone we know. So we're not going in and saying, oh, hey, let's bring this tech to you. That's not the way that we've been operating. Number two, within the places we're invited, we have a board, and we have this incredible new person who just started 3 weeks ago, Upile Chisawa, who's leading all of the Poieto Works programming. So essentially, Upile works with the boards from each school district, and we create our own boards where we craft and we pay and recognize the labor involved in sourcing local knowledge, and then we incorporate that into the curriculum. So it's I guess, responsive curriculum. We do a lot of work, and I really want to acknowledge Inner City Arts. They're absolutely amazing. Colette has been just incredible in working with us. And then we do a lot of work with places like Gang Free has invited us to go into some of these places, these schools, and start to kind of, work within these systems. So we're trying to meet students kind of from local knowledge, celebrating, things like self-help graphics, celebrating these really beautiful local institutions. And through that, they start to learn about AI. So if you start to see data from people you recognize, you start to see art from people around you, it becomes a lot more real than just like some Barbara Kruger or some Baldessari. There's something really, really beautiful about that. So I definitely really love that work. And I think that's something that we're really trying to do at the bachelor's and master's level, but we're working with education institutions specifically to work with their making labs, to work with their programs. So really meeting people where they are and honoring the communities that exist at the locations, not coming in and taking over.
And could I really briefly add on to some of Christine's really beautiful remarks? I think these are such important and crucial questions that you're working with. And when we were doing this show at OxyArts, we were asking ourselves a lot of the same questions because OxyArts has a lot of youth groups and after-school programs and, young community members coming in. And they actually have a dedicated person, Frankie, the amazing Frankie Fleming, who works with these youth groups and develops these activity and reflection guides that are for primary school age children, this is a bit longer than they usually are, but since we were working with these very dense and kind of heady technologies. And so, they have things like a glossary, a vocabulary, like what is inequity? What is an algorithm? And then activities that ask students to, to say, if you were going to build your own robot, what would you want it to know? What would your robot be able to do? Draw your imagined robot. Is it a cyborg or a machine? So these sort of very, simple and very welcoming, offering a welcoming space to start thinking and developing an engagement with a realm that often, to which engagement is often barred. So I just really admire that work that you're doing, Christine.
It's interesting to me. There's a sort of tension, I guess, between the very rooted in like the an individual, and there's very highly specific social context, kind of situated technology, and the way that applying futures or making use of future imaginings to accomplish artistic, pedagogical, policy making goals, the sort of the specific and the idiosyncratic at the very, very local level versus the wide open spaces and the need to make potentially decisions in designing technologies now for future uses by a broader array of people. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that back and forth between the highly specific local and the sort of either longer range or wider range kind of implications and applications.
Well, I think that's something that we try to address, what I was saying before about kind of tools or interventions that are customizable to context, I think is a really interesting way into that. So, we a couple of weeks ago, Situation Lab launched together with the British Broadcasting Corporation a free open access toolkit for public imagination called The Futures Bazaar. And it's basically, intended to be, you can find it at thefuturesbazaar.com. It's free. You can download it anywhere. I mean, it's only in English so far, but we've already had interest from folks who may want to, apply it elsewhere or translate it into their own language.
B-A-Z-A-A-R?
Yes, thank you. Yes,
just
B-A-Z or Z-A-A-R. Yes, the Futures Bazaar. And so the idea there is that it's a framework for a design jam, essentially, or a meetup or a class meeting. Or, we initially did it as part of the away day of the entire design side of the BBC in 2019, so pre-pandemic. Me and my collaborator there, Filippo Cuttica, and Philo and I hosted and supported by a brilliant cast of trainee designers within the BBC, had people bring in junk from home that they otherwise would have thrown away. So old, remote controls and bicycle helmets and shoes and this stuff. They brought bags of this stuff from all around Britain. We gathered in a concert hall in Manchester and spent the afternoon turning those objects, mundane objects from the present into quite mundane or exotic objects from alternative futures. And these are, this is part of an invitation to those in attendance to kind of, going back to your point, Anne, about making, the invisible visible, to kind of manifest their imaginations using kind of readily to hand materials that don't cost anything. And so this was also a reason why, a few months later, I ran it again at Carnegie Mellon with a totally different group and thought, okay, we should turn this into something that people can use in their own context, because it'll have a life of its own, and we'll learn something collectively. This is what I meant about creating something that lets people learn together, learn something about how imaginaries work in different locations to the extent that it gets taken up in different locations. So I just got a DM yesterday from a guy who works in local government in Melbourne, Australia, who ran a Futures Bazaar with, I think, 120 public servants earlier this week, and next week he's doing it with another 180. Haven't had a chance to see what they made yet, but I think that this is an instance, I guess, of the kind of toggling that you were talking about between the, sort of the generalizable or the shareable registers of conversation and, tools that maybe can be adapted to make sense in very disparate contexts versus the specifics of what comes out within those disparate contexts. And this is something I'm very interested in, because I think, not to contradict what Brian said about changing 50% of your curriculum every year, but I think it might be possible to attend to in curriculum and in our practices to processes that actually build in the expectation of change. So, I think of futures literacy, or being able to think pluralistically and concretely and diversely about different futures, as a sort of transferable skill set that you can apply every year, because whatever is going on, you renew your thinking about the futures in light of that. And so that too is another instance, I guess, of finding a way to not split the difference exactly, but to have a kind of generalizable approaches that are actually about recognizing and working with specificity as it arises.
Just to briefly add on to that, I think what we are really seeing at this moment is a shift away from thinking about universal sort of global solutions to differently scaled solutions. And we're seeing a shift from the logic and politics of big data to the logics and politics of small data or community-based data. And I look to folks like the Design Justice Network for a template for how to think in this way. And much of their work is about developing a set of principles for what it means to work with communities in a way that centers community members, in a way that is led by community members, and in a way that it is not easy to extrapolate out and apply to other communities or other contexts, and shouldn't be, because each community should be the primary voice in determining which technologized solutions correspond to its specific needs.
Right. Yeah. I think you can also do that in design. And I think that's one of the things, at least we've tried prototyping or practicing very specifically with the tools that we craft. Is this something that should be shared or not shared? And what are the principles that you're incorporating? And so Design Justice is a great example. Algorithmic Justice League, DARE. There's so many organizations. So how do we take those principles, attribute them, but have each organization decide how they're designing with it specifically? And I think for us, I wouldn't say a slider or a toggle switch is the answer. I know in design, we tend to go towards those quick solutions, but it really is about consent. And I think the thing that we're looking at, like specifically when we work with local communities, we being the Poieto team, and we're setting up systems for individuals to use, considering, do they want to share it? Do they want to share it locally? Is it going into the cloud? For example, with some specific tribal nations, their information cannot go into the cloud. So how are you storing it locally? How are you storing it on the local server? And what knowledge is paired with that information, right? And so those are hard things to figure out in design specifically, but really important to get right, or, people definitely will fear using your product or your approach if it's something that it doesn't promote that local safety, I guess, that digital safety, right? So really interesting approaches.
So I have a question for you. I don't want to get it too dark here, but if you used threat casting in your work, what would you use it to investigate? I'll just leave that out there.
Pass.
For the last few years, I've been working on a project that's coming out finally in the next few months. It's an artist book called The Institute for Other Intelligences through Artist Books. And the basic idea bridges media studies and speculative fiction to imagine this distant future in which algorithmic agents and intelligent machines are training one another to develop just and equitable outcomes. And so the first thing I did in writing this out was to write out the list of prospective futures that I was trying to mitigate in imagining this scenario. And the list is very, very, very long, and I won't belabor the point, but predictive policing, fintech algorithms, judicial risk assessment algorithms, computations that are unsustainable and ecologically hazardous, algorithmic bias, so on and so forth. We could, I could sit here into the wee hours of the morning listing them out. But that's just a taste.
So you were kind of starting from the solution and looking backwards toward all the the factors that you're mitigating. Yeah.
I think that, so Brian alluded to the fact that there are lots of different practices for different purposes. And I think one of the things that is interesting and potentially generative about how some of the kind of critical futures practices that are part of the tradition I most identify with are interested in enabling us to think pluralistically about a whole array of things that could happen prior to labeling whether we think of them as good things or bad things. So being able to diversify the array of imaginable trajectories into alternative futures, and then asking kind of, after describing what they are, to what extent they are, normative or to be avoided at all costs. I think, for instance, there's a process that comes from the work of the political science professor I studied with at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Jim Dader, whose work, kind of early work in the futures field, kind of as it was coalescing as a field, was looking kind of empirically at the landscape of different kinds of stories that people tell about futures in all sorts of contexts, all sorts of people, all sorts of places, all sorts of circumstances. And the typology that kind of arose from looking at that was continued growth stories, collapse or decline stories, discipline or concerted adherence to particular values stories, and transformation, and each of those can have many different variants because they are framed as kind of generic images of the future, as in the way a genus corresponds to many different species. These are genera or generic images of futures that correspond to many particular scenarios or stories that we might tell. And part of the practice there is to ask what kinds of growth, collapse, discipline, or transform trajectory are possible for whatever topic or whatever community or whatever place you're thinking about. And then to ask, what might this be like to experience? Rather than sort of generating it out of the question of, let's come up with a scary thing that we want to avoid, and sort of almost, sorry, that's a really interesting sound. I don't know if there's
the non-human communication.
Yeah, right. So the artificial intelligentsia is coming right this way. So I think, not to dodge the question exactly, but just to jujitsu it a little bit, I think there can be value in, in some contexts, in not preemptively labeling something as threat or promise, but in being willing to ask what might be possible, and then have a conversation which will often surface different perspectives on what good and worth pursuing actually constitutes. And I think this is a valuable thing to bear in mind in relation to, say, electoral processes, like today being the midterm elections. Who the hell knows what's going to happen with all that? But I mean, I dream of a context in which, not just in the United States, but anywhere that considers itself a democratic polity that is interested in synthesizing and pursuing the kind of, the collective will, for us to make a practice of systematically exploring what the alternative futures are on the table, and then to ask, okay, and what would that mean for our political choices? So a kind of backcasting or a kind of threat casting, but maybe without starting with the presupposition that this is a bad thing or this is a good thing. Let's just see what it might be.
Okay. I'm just thinking, sorry.
Oh, that's what that sound is. Okay.
Yeah, that's
right.
Do we have any questions from the audience? If you have a question, please make your way to the microphone. All right. I guess, so another question I have for you all is, so I do think that this question of how we imagine futures and how we use that what we use that imagining for, is a really significant question for creative practitioners and art and design education. And I'm going to ask you guys a question again that I had asked Brian, which is really what is necessary to prepare the students at ArtCenter for the fact that, whether they are conscious of it or not, they're speculating and imagining futures all the time in their work. And so how do we facilitate their futures literacy, or how do we orient them to thinking about all these kinds of questions about whose future, or local versus long-term, global, or I don't know. Yeah. What should we be building into our education here?
I think one of the first things is really kind of having the students here connect with Anti-Racist Classroom and learn and start to kind of see what information exists here. Look at the people working in this space, Arden, looking at Elizabeth, just some of the wonderful folks here. Also, I obviously have a bias. I learned under an MDP, and Elise Coe was my advisor, and I learned a lot from my peers, but really taking time to learn these different perspectives and knowledge and information, before you start to imagine a future. Try and see the landscape that you're in first, and connect and find the critical voices in your community and organization. I guess for ArtCenter, that would probably be the first thing. Yeah.
Certainly, I would co-sign Christine's remarks about starting from an anti-racist grounding, and recognizing that any future that we script as makers or designers or thinkers is never it's agreeing with me. The sound it's accelerating toward the future I'm articulating as we speak. But recognizing that any future that we script as thinkers, makers, and artists is not a neutral future or a nebulous, free-floating future. It already has a political value and a perspective attached to it. So then the question becomes not, is this future politicized in a particular way, and what is our role, a politicized role as artists and makers, but rather how are we deploying that role from a place that starts off recognizing that already deeply enmeshed nature of the work we do.
Yeah, I think those are excellent answers, and both the need for a kind of deepened attentiveness to when and where and who is having the conversation as starting point and kind of table stakes for then being able to have a more constructive, less sort of unhinged and flapping in the wind kind of speculative effort, which, because I do see quite a lot of both unhinged and flapping in the wind speculation, over the last decade or so. I think that part of it has to do with also just doing more of it and kind of developing a bit of a palette for what grounded and interesting and novel, as opposed to cliche stuff that we've seen a gazillion times. Like that I sort of am interested in how to accelerate that getting of wisdom for people. And I think in a weird way that play might be part of a key to it. So often I think that, design and art students engaging in a sort of speculative effort kind of go down one rabbit hole and fall in love with their first few ideas. And I think that a sort of a more thoroughgoing and expansive futures literacy would if that were in place, people would understand that the first idea they have is just one of a million ideas that they could have, and being more sort of deliberate or choiceful, as I don't know how I feel about that word, but it feels kind of right for this context, about which futures to bring to life, because imagination is an investment, and I think, Janet Murray in Hamlet on the Holodeck talks about the idea of, investing imagination. I'm maybe paraphrasing, but sort of investing imagination in particular directions. And I think that, seeing it as a sort of, in principle, unbounded, but in practice, always bounded by how much time you have and, what your resources are. What are you giving your attention to? I think that maybe argues for, for spending more of our time in futures that we and those we are trying to serve actually, consider to be worthwhile ones. So I've kind of moved away from more Black Mirror-ish explorations. I feel like we're good on that stuff. That our collective imaginaries are replete with, with worst case scenarios, and the more radical and difficult and necessary thing to do is kind of to make fragments of or immersions into futures that we can all get excited about, and that might catalyze different kinds of not just design action, but political action and community action. That's what I would like to see more of.
Great. Okay. I don't know how we're doing for time. Max, can you where's my timekeeper person? Oh, okay. So we've still got, all right. We're okay. We can keep going. All right. Q&A. Do we have questions? Are people online asking any questions? Where's our inquisitive?
All I can see is the purple light and a thing that says warning underneath it, right next to where the noise is coming from. So
I was just going to say, I don't have a question, but I did want to say what you're hearing is the HVAC, and this is a new noise. This is an emergent audio environment. So we're working to see what's causing it and how we might fix it. But until then, that's what it is.
Okay. Thank you, Maggie, for clarifying that. We're just going to think of it as the entity who's here with us. Right. Okay. We've got a question.
Hello. First of all, this has been a really, really fascinating conversation. So thank you all. I'm still kind of, my question is kind of stewing a little bit, but I'm going to try. Basically, I'm really curious in a sort of professional setting or a practical setting where you're trying to design something. How do we consider and deal with the problems around like incentives, when maybe the incentives of how our creation is going to be used and why it's going to be used and what it's being created for, when oftentimes that stuff can be outside of what we're asked to design and outside of the brief has already been written with, some kind of set of assumptions, and how do we kind of push back on that or position our response to it to kind of take that into consideration.
Did you say incentives?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't.
Showstopper, right?
No, this is a really great and important question, and I think I don't know that it's always in our gift as consultants or more say junior employees starting out in an organization to be able to sort of fully renovate the incentive structures that we might like to. But I guess perhaps I'm a hammer looking for nails here, but part of my recommendation in relation to that would be that if an argument can be mounted for taking longer term consequences into account, that some of the things that are currently within an organization seen as externalities, like something that people other than your immediate customers might see as problematic or as risky, if that can be sort of internalized as part of, we should actually be taking that stuff into account, because sooner or later that's going to cause a problem. It's almost like bringing a little bit of a, there are many hats in futures, but the black hat is useful if people are undervaluing the concerns that could result from actually just deciding too narrowly on the basis of too small a set of design considerations. So I think kind of broadening what's discussable within the conversation by sort of saying, well, what about, how's this going to look in the longer term, might be one move that one could make.
Thank you for your question.
So now I have a question. Also, it's noodling. Questions are hard in these formats, right? I'm considering the following, that we've spoken a little bit about what future states could be or how one might identify or discern them. We've talked a little bit about participation, and I think participation is a form of transformation, right? What is the role of a design future in making change, as opposed to considering, I can envision each of these, a book, a scenario, a format, a story. That doesn't necessarily inform us how to make that change. And change is transition, right? That's your CMU but what is that medium of transition, and what is the role of a designer or a future spellcaster in making that change? I don't even know if that makes sense as a question.
Well, I'm going to go back to Brian's example of backcasting. I mean, I think in an applied context, right, where the whole point of the future imagining is in order to make some decisions right now in preparation for that future. I guess it has to do with the context, right, in which the future is being imagined, which is a very different, that's the applied component, which is very different from the futures that are imagined to provoke new thinking or criticality of the world around us, which is a much harder thing to pinpoint when transitions or transformations begin. And your work is so much about people, a shift in mindset or understanding is a much more nebulous thing than we need to build something to protect against something. Sorry, I'm answering the question.
I think that I'm inclined to de-bifurcate the conversation about what it's possible to imagine and the kind of the immediate Monday morning question of what it's possible to do, because I think those things are more on a continuum, and that the making it possible to imagine something that it wasn't previously possible to imagine, that is in itself already a meaningful intervention, because it makes it those are the conditions of possibility for even, striving towards a preferred or away from a non-preferred future. So I mean, I actually think that the immediate sort of what are we going to do on Monday morning, or what's our strategy for next quarter or the next electoral cycle, there are lots of practices that already serve those more immediate time horizons. And without saying, let's sweep all that out of the way and just sort of think about decades all the time, to me, it's more like a Google Maps or something, where, let's say, if you're driving across the country, as I did last summer, coming back from the Berggruen Fellowship here in LA, back home in Pittsburgh, sometimes I needed to be able to see, the scale of the continent or what state I'm passing through next. And then very often I'm sort of more zoomed in and need to know whether to turn left or right at the end of this intersection. But it's having both of those and, those zoom levels and others in between that makes the entire journey possible. And so by analogy, I think that making sort of design-led interventions of the sort of more speculative variety that some of us that we've been talking about here, whether through the mode of threat casting or speculative design or pick your term or your preferred mode of intervention. But I think that longer term stuff is basically, it's like in a kind of Gregory Bateson sense, interventions in an ecology of mind. It's making stuff more thinkable on a longer time horizon. And then there are a bunch of other things that are more immediate, that are well taken care of by strategic processes and by, they may not be really well taken care of, but they're, at least most people are thinking most of the time about more immediate futures, and what needs to supplement that, not supplant it, is more vividly imagined portraits of the alternative worlds that we're making.
I think this is a really vital question, and one that we should all be asking ourselves, at very regular intervals. And I often turn to the formulation of Jose Munoz that the aesthetic field, the field of aesthetic practice, is a place where we draw speculative blueprints for a forward dawning futurity. But then the question arises, okay, how do we move from the speculative blueprint into building the house? Like, when are we going to build the house? When are we going to pick up the hammer? And I think, there are 1,000 ways to answer this, but as someone who works very closely with the cultural output of communities who are facing systemic erasure, the simple existence of a cultural artifact, the simple existence of a design object, the simple existence of a field of cultural output is itself already a political intervention, because it makes a claim for the continued existence of that community. And so in perhaps this is a bit of a cop-out, but but in that respect, I think we can think of these things as already carrying a political force from the jump.
I absolutely agree and align. 100% looking at what that cultural artifact represents and how that is a bridge and a gateway, and very specifically looking at, voice design is a really good example. If we're looking at gendering of voices, just to get very specific, you can talk about something that's way out, in the future. You can talk about these more speculative approaches, but I think one of the things that we see happening is people starting to craft for themselves, starting to understand the prototyping processes. And one of the things that was very difficult but wonderful to experience here, leaving media design practices and then crafting a practice of working in a space where you're co-crafting tools with folks. How do you take something like a conceptual blueprint, and turn it into a prototype or a tool that can prototype these different cultural artifacts? And so that's where I feel like there's a wonderful bridge between creating a space where people can craft artifacts that represent their future, and start to kind of see that spectrum, as you were talking about, Stuart, that spectrum in between, these really kind of intense future scenarios and the reality of not even owning a computer, right? There's a spectrum of kind of where we are. So, yeah. Thanks.
I think that, so designers have a lot of, do we have another question? Come on up. Hello. I've asked a lot of questions.
It's me again. So this is kind of in the same realm of like the question that everybody is asking, but yeah, I'm very curious to know, have you seen a best way to create a sense of urgency around the things that, again, specifically marginalized communities may not have the resources, knowledge, or awareness of the things that they may not even have those things to change in their own. I think of like Flint, Michigan, right? It's like the water crisis there. There wasn't really an awareness or resources or anything to change on their own, but it became a big problem when it was too late, when people were realizing, oh, I'm having all these things going on with my health because of the water. I also think of like, we've seen this movie, Don't Look Up, where it's like, oh, people get it after it's too late when the, climate change and everything like that. So I'm just curious to know, like, have you all seen a way that is most effective in creating urgency and saying, okay, now we need to change this? Is it like a timeline? Is it some other things? So yeah, I don't know if that made sense, but
does make sense.
Please. I insist.
I can respond maybe with a very specific example. And I think language is such a wonderful way to communicate urgency of a situation. To give you an example, my co-teacher at California College of the Arts, Christina Gaitan, and I are teaching a speculative project that's looking at climate adaptation, right? And there's very specific choice of using the word adaptation, right? How you're recognizing what's happening. We're saying this is a statement. It's not, we're not looking at change. We understand that we need to start to adapt within this space, and what prototypes are we creating to really kind of show this reality. So I think language is, to me, kind of the most immediate go-to.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, a lot of the work that I've done looks at how artists and designers put on the hat of the organizer as well. And I think that one really important shift that we're seeing more of, and I think we need to see even more of, is this recognition that if you are a designer, an artist, a maker of any kind, you are also already doing a kind of political organizing. So then you need to ask yourself, what are the communities that you want to be in dialogue with, or that you are already in dialogue with? How can you participate in collective efforts? What collective efforts is your work already embedded within, or hopefully not working against? So really, I think what this moment and its urgencies and vicissitudes call for is a paradigmatic shift in how we identify ourselves and the role that we perform in the work that we do.
My mind goes to practices of artistic activism, and there's an organization out of New York called the Center for Artistic Activism, run by some friends of ours and collaborators of many years, and I think that kind of attending to that again as kind of a competency, or something not just to sort of look at project by project, but sort of as a skill set that can be deployed to kind of to intervene in the circuits of attention that operate to create political priorities in the media sphere. Those practices, I think, are really interesting and important. And school actually is a pretty good place to start to incubate those kinds of practices, just given that it's that little bit more buffered against market forces, hopefully still a little bit, than being in a typical workplace. Back when, I was a grad student at the University of Hawaii, and my colleague Jake Dunnigan and I did a project years ago now, 15 years ago, speaking with people in Chinatown, Honolulu. This was a small kind of experimental art project funded by the Hawaii Arts Alliance. And we were interested in hearing what futures the people who lived and worked in that neighborhood, in that district of Honolulu, what they were thinking about that maybe wasn't manifest or part of the official conversation. And so one of the futures that came out of those conversations was a real concern about gentrification in this space that had been there had never been a national US retail or restaurant chain in this neighborhood for over 150 years plus of the colonial era. It still hadn't kind of made that full commercial turn yet, and so we basically in a sort of parallel or a precursor to the project that I started out showing, where, you know, it was sort of an interview with a particular person about the futures they imagine. In this case, we were working with people within a neighborhood, thinking about the futures of that neighborhood and then creating artifacts. In this particular case, there were several scenarios, but one was about, you know, suddenly Starbucks was moving in on the corner into this building that had been empty for 3 years. Well, it wasn't actually moving in, but we made it look as though it was, and we forced it onto the front page of the state newspaper as a conversation to have, because this was something that people were worried about, but there was no forum in which it was taking place. I think that's a little example of a kind of design or interventionist stance, and there are many others, but, you know, I'm just speaking from my limited experience, that I think can be really vital sites of a kind of pulling focus on the conversations that we need to be having about things either that we want to move towards or that we want to move away from. And that's a way of finding out which is which for who.
I really like the way that you phrased that, pulling focus. I think this idea of pulling focus and making visible and developing an apparatus of visibility around certain issues that one is working with is really something that we can take not only from the tactics of organizing, but also the tactics of marketing and PR.
Totally.
And I think about groups like Decolonize This Place and MTL Collective and the work that they're doing, which is fusing art, design, activism, and also, really sophisticated forms of digital marketing, really. And that's, I think that we need to think in those ways in order to understand how to address social ills that are operating within those systems.
Okay, thank you, everybody. This is really fantastic. It was great to hear from all three of you. I just wanted to do a little quick wrap-up synopsis. It's just really interesting. I just want to call attention for our audience and for our students to the way that this idea of futuring or imagining futures manifests in really different contexts, right? We see, at Intel where a chip manufacturer has to think about what capacities are going to be required down the line, given the demands of manufacturing. In a military context, we see imagining a future allows us to make decisions right now and prepare for situations that we might have to address, right? But then in Stuart's practice, imagining futures tends to be in the landscape of civic engagement and policy and larger questions about governance. And then, imagining futures as Mashinka engages with artists and activists, thinking about how we interrogate and investigate technologies and futures to think in a new way about them or be critical of them. And then in Christine's work, so much how we use prototyping and future imagining in a very, very local context. And in my classroom, in my backyard, with my friends, with my people. And so I just think that there's such a broad range of options. And I just think that each one of these practices really offers different entry points for creative practitioners who want to do this kind of work. I think it's you've all demonstrated how relevant and necessary and vital this work is. The idea of things that are thinkable or knowable or makeable or imaginable is really demanding work and really important and critical work. So thank you all so much for the examples that you set for us today. There we go.